Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Jessica Studdert. I am the Deputy Chief Executive of New Local. Really excited to have this panel session with you. We've got a brilliant lineup of speakers. I told them all to choose their seating in our lovely little set we've got here for you. So this session, Politics as Though People Matter. Really pleased to welcome Danny Kruger, who is the MP for Devizes and also the co-founder of the Social Covenant Unit. We've got Tracy Brabin, who is the Mayor of West Yorkshire. She's also the first female Metro Mayor, which is brilliant, and former MP for Batley and Spen. So you have an interesting perspective on this. And we've got Will Tanner, who is the director of Onward, and very well known to many of us community power kind of activists, is really pushing an interesting agenda in this space. So I should say, unfortunately, Jess Phillips was supposed to be joining us, but she's had a family bereavement, so she can't be with us, but we obviously wish her all the best. This session, we really wanted it to be an opportunity for us to talk about the sort of growing sense of alienation that many people feel from our institutions, of how we do politics, how people are engaged in how we do politics, and how much of what happens in Westminster actually kind of filters through to the communities and where a lot of energy is happening, where a lot of dynamism is happening. So how can we kind of think about how we need to do politics differently? I'm going to turn to each of our panellists in turn for their kind of perspective on the issue, but I would encourage you, hopefully you've got the Slido kind of information, you've been doing it already for the different sessions. Please do ask lots of questions and we'll get them up and I'll be able to put them to the panel. But I hope you enjoy the session. So welcome to our New Local front room. Tracy, I just want to kick off with you because you've obviously you've seen it from both sides. You've been a politician in Westminster and now you're a Metro Mayor. What's your sense of the kind of alienation and how does it kind of manifest itself from the different sides of politics you've seen?
Well, thank you for the invitation today, and it's great to see so many people here, and my friends from People Powerhouse are also here, so shout out to them. I mean, it's been an really interesting journey from being an actor and a writer for 3 decades to then, after the murder of Joe Cox, becoming the Member of Parliament for my hometown. And then when devolution was being discussed in Parliament, I was a real advocate for One Yorkshire. I thought we needed to bring power, money and influence further to the people that were affected. And certainly seeing decisions in Parliament being made that impacted on our communities when people had no clue actually the lives that were being lived in those communities. And often there would be a up north sort of a wave of the hand when we were talking about transport or buses or whatever. And I just felt that this was a real opportunity, devolution, to get power and money and to make a difference for my community. I have to say that being in opposition is quite tough because you can see the problems that face your community and it's very hard to make the biggest impact that you know that you could. So devolution is about bringing that power out of Whitehall and Westminster and bringing it closer to the people that it affects. And it is an amazing job. And if anybody knew how brilliant being a mayor was, they would all want to do it. And certainly being a representative of 51% of the population as the first ever woman Metro Mayor, I think it's also incumbent upon me to empower women in West Yorkshire as well and to enable them to have better lives and opportunities. So it is that bringing that power from Whitehall and Westminster, but it is still challenging. Whilst we were able, because of the devolution deal, to get 830 million from the city region transport, sustainable transport settlement, 830 million, a huge amount of money. We know what we want to spend it on, but anything over 50 million, we have to go back to government to get the sign-off. When we're talking about investment in buildings and infrastructure, there are often debates with people in Westminster about whether we can have the green roof on our bus station. Now, this isn't devolution, so we are having a challenge. And I would say to government, it's very difficult when ministers in departments are tasked with delivering money to the regions because they have obligations themselves that we have to go through ministers. It would be so much easier if we could deal as mayors directly with the Treasury and we could deliver. And we have proof that we deliver. You can trust us to deliver. We have our own checks and balances. But it is quite challenging. So on the one hand, we have devolution, but on the other hand, some of those powers are pulled back. Now, I was really excited about the Levelling Up White Paper. I do think Michael Gove has a determination to get things done and extend devolution. But I think the session today is really important, because what is important for me as a Yorkshire woman, born and raised, and I'm so proud to be from Yorkshire, that it's a co-production, that everything I do is a co-production. So, for example, when I was giving evidence to the Select Committee about the really disappointing outcome of the Integrated Rail Plan, I was able to say to the public, tell Tracy about your train experiences and tell that to the Select Committee. As the Police and Crime Commissioner, and I'm only one of 2 mayors that have that responsibility, Andy Burnham is the other, I am able to have that sort of Venn diagram where I can, in making my police and crime plan, we were able to consult more widely than we've ever done before with young people, older people, sex workers, the traveller community, students, to inform my police and crime plan and listen to them. But what's also exciting is that I can then use my powers elsewhere to impact on the police and crime plan. So women in West Yorkshire were telling me that they didn't feel safe, and that historic child sex exploitation was a priority and a worry for the people of West Yorkshire. So we have been able to work up a plan that really does speak to those concerns. So it is a conversation. It is about opening the door and being incredibly accessible. I am the voice of the passenger. I use public transport. People are often quite astonished to see their mayor on the bus. But I think that's the only way to be an authentic voice for West Yorkshire. And I know we want to open it up to questions, so I'll finish there. But I think the consultation is important, listening to the public and making sure that Westminster doesn't get in the way, because they are strangers. They don't know us. There has to be that trust. And I hope that as we continue to deliver, be innovative, be exciting, be bold around culture, around housing, that we can get the trust of government and, enable us to fly in proper devolution.
I was going to ask you, actually, because you touched on it, do you feel you have a different kind of relationship with the electorate as a mayor to the one you did when you were an MP? Is there anything, you're talking about this kind of conversation that you're able to have in your position now, is there anything you'd say Westminster can learn from that approach that becomes more natural to being a kind of a locally elected politician?
Well, I think it would be really important for ministers to get out and about and to get into communities, to understand communities, and to know that the identity of communities is so different. So, for example, Wakefield is quite different to Huddersfield. Leeds is very different to Bradford. Halifax, amazing Peace Hall, all our culture. But by putting us together and having that voice, we are stronger together. We are greater than the sum of our parts. And I think that's sort of amorphous idea of who the North is, or who lives, in Manchester or the Northwest. I think it's really important that people in positions of authority really do come out and about. And I've been invited to speak on some panels talking about, devolution in the North and so on. And it's all about the North, and it's in London. And I just think we've got a job of work to do to try and get ministers to come up to the North. It's happening in Leeds. We've got a number of government departments, the Bank of England, the Infrastructure Bank, HMRC. But it isn't just about plonking civil servants in Leeds on London salaries so that they can get back to their homes in London and do a lot of commuting. It's about growing our own workforce to work for government with that authentic voice. And I think it is about listening to the people that you represent.
Great, thank you. Danny, I want to turn to you. You're obviously known as a big kind of champion of community power within the Conservative Party, within government. What's your sort of sense of what's your diagnosis of the challenge of alienation from Westminster?
Thank you. Well, and thanks for having me. And this is tremendous. And all credit to you guys, to New Local, and this movement that's forming and strengthening across the country. And as Tracy was just saying, there's such an appetite, I think, for meaningful devolution, for power to be properly placed with communities. And as Tracy says, the government's very committed to doing what it can from the centre, which is about handing power back and creating the structures of localism through a devolution agenda, which was set out in the white paper, and that's being responded to really enthusiastically by local leaders. And I think we're going to see something tremendous over the next 10 years as these new structures take hold in places. But perhaps more excitingly, and I think what you guys are really about, and what I'm inspired by, is the sort of the pull, not the push, of community power, and the way that people in all of our communities are taking back control. And that's the spirit of the age. And it's the job of government to respond to it. So that's partly what the white paper was about, devolution, new deals for cities and counties. But it's also about enabling parishes to set up and assert power and responsibility locally. And beyond the formal structures of government, encouraging people to come together and to design their own bespoke local solutions outside the statutory system, but in proper partnership with the state. And we've seen that with enormous inspirational power during COVID, when all of us became involved in neighborhood-based initiatives to support each other. And now we're seeing it again with the Ukrainian refugee crisis, an absolutely incredible outpouring of generosity and practical support and self-organized community response. And it's the job of government to catch up with that, which it struggles to do, because that's what government is clunky. So I think something tremendous is happening. It's part of a new consensus. I'm inspired by, giving credit where it's due, the Labour Council of Wigan, particularly. Is Donna Hall here? She's on the list. As the chief executive of Wigan through the years of austerity, and I don't know how much this has been discussed and how familiar, I'm sure you're all very familiar with what's happened there. And there are other places as well which have done it, which have decided to empower communities rather than just salami slice budgets. And ultimately, it's by reducing demand for expensive, remedial, acute state services that we'll manage to achieve the fiscal balance which is necessary. So I think something tremendous is happening. I really hope, and I would like to see, I totally echo everything that Tracy said. I want to see a spirit of collaboration across the parties. I also want to see a battle between the parties over who owns this agenda. That's really the way to make it happen. It's not all for us all to sit around in a cozy huddle agreeing with each other. Actually, which party can most authentically claim to be the party of community power? That's the way we're going to make it happen. It's by enfranchising the public to invite people to choose between us about who genuinely speaks for local places. So I think this is a political challenge, not just one for technocratic policy discussions. But I'm very inspired, and I think this is going to be the decade of community power.
Can I ask you? You obviously are making quite a case for it within the Conservative Party and within government. What's the kind of challenge? Like, how do you need to kind of win the argument a bit more about doing politics in this kind of different way and doing community power more?
Well, I think it'll happen by pull as much as push. I mean, we are responsive to the public, more or less, in a democracy, and when our voters demand it, we respond. So this isn't going to happen just by people at the centre or even leaders locally and think tank people coming up with the ideas. It'll happen when people demand it. But there is you're asking, I think, the right question, because there is a political challenge here. My party historically has struggled with local government because frankly, people haven't always voted Conservative in local government. That's the problem. But
we can work together, Danny.
We've got to get over that. And actually, increasingly, they do vote Conservative in local government and in mayoralties. But I think the challenge is for my party to recognise that actually it is a very Conservative agenda to empower people, to trust them, to understand that people will make good decisions for themselves and their neighbours if they're empowered with that responsibility, rather than thinking everything has to be done from the centre. So I think this is completely consistent with my party's philosophy. And there's a tremendous Labour and Liberal, every political tradition has a localism strand. And we need to, as I say, we need to be fighting over fighting over this agenda.
Yeah, no, I like that. Thank you. Will, just turn to you. Obviously, at Onward, we're big friends of Onward at New Local and big fans of your work. You've done a lot to kind of, I guess, evidence and kind of spread the word about this kind of level of disconnect between, I think you were the person who coined the phrase, or the term Workington man, but the kind of the disconnect between places and where decisions are made. So what's your kind of sense of the challenge when it comes to our democracy and that kind of democratic deficit?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. Also in these splendid surroundings, the City of London Corporation obviously being a prime example of historic civic power. So it's very fitting as well to be here. So thank you for having me. So I think this is a really important question, and I hope that as the only non-politician on the panel, I'll be able to say some things that perhaps Danny and Tracy can't. I think the first thing to say, which is perhaps something that Danny and Tracy can't say, is that we shouldn't underestimate the level of cynicism amongst voters and the local populations, just around the intentions and the nature of politics today. So I spend much of my time doing research, doing focus groups in parts of the country some people might call left behind, the cynicism and the skepticism about policymakers' motives is really deep-seated, and I think that has always been there to some degree, but it's certainly greater than at any time since I've been studying politics. And we saw this during the Brexit years. We've seen this, I think, to some degree in the last few years too, and you see it in the polling numbers. One response to that is to say we need to learn to argue less, and that politics has become too tribal, and that everyone should just learn to get along a bit better. I actually profoundly disagree with that. Just picking up on something Danny said at the end there. I think the problem in politics is that we have stopped disagreeing well. And that what we need to encourage in our politics is yes, a civil and good-natured, but it's at times kind of fiery debate between different interest groups about what the right path is, and for that to be a kind of a visible disagreement of different aims. And there's a great book that recently came out called Conflicted by Ian Leslie, who tells the story of the Wright brothers who their father taught them to quite literally swap sides in the middle of an argument so that they could experience the other person's perspective, the kind of Socratic method. And that was, so the fable goes, one of the reasons why they were so inventive, because it led to fundamentally more kind of innovative thinking, genuinely more kind of productive activity. It's one of the reasons why they invented all the things they did. And I think we need a little bit of that spirit in our politics. We need to move away from the quite consensual, actually quite comfortable kind of view that we just need to all get along. We do need that kind of battle for ideas that Danny talked about around this community power agenda. And we need, I think, our politics to be kind of focused on disagreeing, but disagreeing well. The second thing I was going to say was that I think within that and alongside that, we need to quite fundamentally change the way in which we do policy. So I think for a long time we've had this kind of top-down, centralised method of policy making. Everyone knows that we're one of the most centralised policies in the world, and so I think we do need to kind of move to a more community-led model. The fundamental reason for that, though, is not kind of necessarily a moral or principled or philosophical point. It's actually an economic and efficiency argument. You simply get much better results when you involve local people in decision making, and you can see that in the planning system. You go down to Nansleden in Cornwall. The council wanted to build 1,000 homes. They then engaged the community through a proper charrette process. They ended up building 4,000 homes because the community were convinced that if they accepted more homes, they'd get 2 primary schools, they'd get a share of homes built by local labour. And so the way to get over some of people's local opposition to policy and actually buy them into policy making is to involve them in the process. And I think we need to do that much more systematically by rule rather than by exception. And that is starting to happen, but at the moment it's still far too rare. And then just a final point, which does build quite heavily on what both Tracy and Danny was saying, is I think we need to move to a model of policy making that is about empowerment, not about kind of doing things to people or communities. And actually the Homes for Ukraine policy is a kind of really prime example of how policy has shifted. So I spent 3 years in the Home Office dealing with refugee policy on the other end of the spectrum, which was kind of struggling with councils to try and find homes and ending up putting thousands and thousands of people into terrible conditions in hotels. And there are 10,000 Afghan families in hotels today. I mean, it's an appalling record of policy making in that area. But when the government decided to use people's homes, people's private generosity, find this outpouring of support and people's willingness to actually go significantly above and beyond. And those are the very same people who previously might have been resistant to council putting up or taking up private rented accommodation to house refugees. We need to play much more to kind of the empowerment and use those intermediary institutions, whether those are private households, whether those are parish councils, which Danny mentioned, or kind of civic organisations within communities, as the kind of vehicle for policy, rather than assuming that the state, whether that's local government or national government bluntly, is always the best deliverer of services. And I think if we can do that, then you not only build capacity within those institutions, but you can also start to foster a much more kind of adaptive and innovative political culture. So yeah, those are those three things that I
I'm just interested in what you were saying about kind of building consensus and that kind of, I guess, tribal but kind of polarising politics we have. We're seeing lots of councils and lots of experimentation with things like citizens' assemblies or participatory budgeting and just ways in which people can be involved in decisions outside the traditional representative democracy election cycle, for example. Do you think there's more scope for doing more of that, doing that on a national level, Westminster thinking about doing that more?
So I think there is. I'm sceptical about integrating things like citizens' assemblies within kind of full-blown parliamentary democracy, because I think ultimately that's what parliamentary democracy is for. And if you're having to invent alternative mechanisms to engage people, then that suggests that the parliamentary democratic methods that we have relied upon for centuries are not working as efficiently as they should be, and that you should probably address those dysfunctions
I guess that's kind
rather
of my question.
than.
Do we need to, is there a way that people can be kind of encouraged on a more ongoing dialogue basis than just?
So I think this comes down to how we do politics and the mechanisms by which we do it. I mean, so the planning system is a really good example where we obviously have quite a bureaucratic, quite reactive planning system at the moment. If you turn that on its head and you have a proactive and kind of community-focused system through charrettes or something similar, then what you tend to see is huge amounts of engagement, that engagement being very productive and actually adding to the planning process, creating more beautiful buildings, better development, greater community buy-in, and it leads to both better policy and happier communities who are more engaged in the political process. And we need to apply those type of principles, I think, to the rest of politics rather than just, I think the problem when you just start creating new mechanisms, I'm not necessarily against new methods, by the way, but they shouldn't be used to just plaster over the cracks of the existing system. We need to think about how it fits in.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, thank you. Well, listen, Danny, you won't be able to see this, but on the screen behind us, we've got people voting on various questions that have been submitted. Thank you very much for those who have. Given we're talking about democracy, I'm going to ask the one that's been upvoted the most by the audience. So the question is, community-led initiatives are often short-term. Why, after all these years, are we still unable to commit to long-term sustainable community empowerment? And this is something we hear a lot. People in communities, councils as well, but people in communities need certainty. They need to kind of draw on long-term funding investment. And it's that kind of insecure environment or the fact that they're kind of constrained by what they need to bid for that kind of determines their actions. And actually, how can we kind of free our communities up more by providing that stability? Danny, can I ask you and I guess again, what's stopping this happening or what's stopping this getting through to the people making decisions in Westminster?
Well, yes, it is the essential question in many ways. Well, obviously part of the reason is Treasury funding cycles, which we all are very familiar with. A related one is the silos of spending and the sort of departmentitis, which afflicts our politics and makes it very difficult to pool budgets, which of course they need to be if we're trying to prevent social problems developing and come up with sustainable community-led solutions. So the structures of government and the cycles of budgeting are enormous barriers. There is work going on in that area. It's very much recognised and understood. We've had a 3-year spending review. There'll be further long-term spending commitments made, but I rather agree with the premise of the question. Why, if we can make capital investment decisions for 10 years to build a motorway or airport or train station. Why can't we do that on the social infrastructure side? The other reason is political, and just the changing fashions of politics and the institutional inertia and the tendency to entropy and to just kind of centralize and collapse. So Will mentioned the enormous opportunity that I think we have in neighbourhood planning and planning policy of community empowerment. That was, in fact, and Will was in government at the time, when David Cameron's government introduced neighbourhood plans after 2010, a great step forward. Many of our communities have really risen to that, put in huge amounts of time and effort into developing neighbourhood planning. But the momentum has gone out of that because of, as I say, institutional inertia, clever developers finding ways around it, rules which say that they have to be updated within a couple of years. So defence of liberty requires constant vigilance, or whatever it is. The same goes for community power. It requires constant attention. And I think, as I say, I think this decade is a time for a resurgence of that energy, but there do need to be some structural changes at the centre as well.
Yeah. Tracy, can I ask you a similar question? From your perspective, how does this kind of short-termism manifest itself and the different kind of funding cycles that you have to deal with?
Well, it's shocking. It's really annoying that we're in this beauty contest rounds of bidding for projects. It takes a lot of capacity, it takes a lot of brain power, and people are being pivoted away from the things we're already trying to deliver in order to pitch for new projects. And it sometimes feels also eccentric why government make decisions about who gets what. Now, we've been really lucky. This week we've got money for 111 electric buses. We're working with bus companies, they're co-funding, but it's the direction of travel that we set, that we're going to hit zero carbon by 2038. 40 million has been allocated from the gain share. It's a priority for us. So I'm really pleased we've got that. But there are other things that we weren't successful at. But we have councils who also have capacity issues. So we've been able to top slice the gain share, the 38 million a year, to give 10% of that to our councils for added capacity for these daft beauty contests. It's not helpful. And I've made this case on a number of occasions. Please trust us we know what we need for our communities, and you'll probably get more bang for your buck if you do that.
Great, thank you. Will, feel free to chime in on that question. I just also want to ask you, or kind of put this second question up here, the second most popular one, because it kind of speaks to the stuff you've been doing about social fabric. The question is, how do we ensure the levelling up agenda uses and strengthens existing social infrastructure, libraries, community-based organisations, etc., rather than reinvent it? And I just wondered if you had some kind of perspective on that, because I know you've been doing a lot of stuff about what's meaningful to communities and not reinventing the wheel.
Well, so the first thing I wanted to say is that, just to riposte to Danny saying the momentum has gone out of neighbourhood planning, because not in the Roman Road neighbourhood plan group that I am part of, where neighbourhood planning is alive and well. But but your point about, or the question about social infrastructure assets, I think is a really, really well-made one, because ultimately these are the assets, these are the networks, these are the institutions which make up the social fabric of communities, and yet we have, as we know, seen a deterioration in that fabric over 30, 40 years, and our work, which Danny was involved in at the beginning, actually, before he became a PPS, has kind of demonstrated that statistically. We've seen this kind of long decline in civic assets, and that ultimately is, I think, one of the reasons why communities feel like their communities are in decline, like their neighbourhoods are falling away from them. How do you sustain that? I mean, I think just going kind of marrying it with the other question, I think we get into quite a dangerous place when those assets start to be maintained as a result of centrally directed taxpayer funding, because I think that makes those assets inherently unpredictable, or the funding streams for those assets inherently unpredictable. We need to find ways of resourcing those assets locally, ideally through the kind of civic sector in all its forms, rather than through necessarily government, either local or central. This is actually one of the reasons why we've been very much in favour of trying to take some of the planning gain through the new consolidated infrastructure levy and siphoning 25% or so of that direct to communities, either through parish councils or to local authorities themselves, in order that some of those assets can be maintained. And that's a private source of income. It happens every time that someone builds a home. It's not at the whim of any minister. It doesn't mean that funding is going to be cut away at the end of a spending review period. It means that there is that kind of bottom-up source of income. And I think we need to look for more of those types of income sources rather than constantly looking upwards to Whitehall, because otherwise this cycle is just going to continue.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you know what, we're already out of time. It feels like it's gone far too quickly. I just want to finish by asking you one question, each of you to answer differently. Say we're 10 years' time, 10 years from now, we're a kind of community-powered country. What's changed? Like, what's different for like a normal person? What do they feel that's different about living in a kind of community-powered world, and how much more connected would they feel to Westminster? But what's the kind of tangible change that we want to see? Danny, I'll go to you first.
Well, I think it'd have a lot more digital engagement. I noticed Audrey Tang's here, there are some initiatives around the world which I think we are way behind. So there'd be some practical innovation. I think people would feel a great sense of belonging to their place, rather than sort of thinking that you've got to get out to get on, this new cliche of ours. And they'd have a sense of agency. They'd feel empowered to influence the decisions that affect them and their family and their neighbours. So I think we'd have a great sort of far more psychically well population if people with genuine sense of belonging and agency.
Great. Tracy?
Yeah, very briefly, that we would have a community and a life that is lived where you have made decisions about the services that are provided for you. So when you leave your home, you will be able to get on the bus that you inputted where you need the bus stops to be and the routes. Yeah. So you've had some sort of conversation about your needs. You've been able to get a course at college because somebody understood and you made the case that this is the type of course that you need. Your kids have been able to do the same. They don't have to leave in order to get, as Danny says, to get on and get in and get on. And also, I think it's about making sure that the civic environment is the space that you want. There is a community centre where you can come together to share ideas. There is a green space where you can walk your dog and have a restful time. And I think the power of community engagement increases well-being, whether that's around culture, whether that's about the access to skills and well-paid, better jobs. It makes sense. It's absolutely, it's A in the alphabet to bring in communities right at the beginning of decision making.
Thank you. Will?
So I think a world in which people have genuine and deep connections to the people around them, whether that's people in their neighbourhood, whether that's associations or organisations that are nearby, whether that's digital communities of interest, but where those connections are much, much stronger than they are today. I think we've let a lot of those relationships wither and not taken care of them over time, and ultimately that's what we're trying to achieve with a community-powered world. We're trying to connect people to one another in their place, and that's the test, that's the litmus test.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. It's felt far too quick, but thank you so much to our panellists. I'm sure you'll join me in giving them a big round of applause while I hand over to Adam.